so it
But
depends
if
on the
they're
person.
Disney,
If they're
then
Disney, yeah, Disney tends to be a little bit
and here's the thing, even if
sketchy,
it
maybe
is
sketch.
in public, Disney will still come after you.
Oh no, it's true. Disney's intense.
Yeah,
But
because
anyway,
I remember when
Steamboat Willie,
Steamboat,
yeah.
I'm like, what's the word?
Steamboat Willie.
It came into public domain, and one person was selling Steamboat Willie puppets. Disney's like, hey, you can't use that. It's in public domain. They can.
And they were just like, yes, no, you can't. Anyway, so Disney, in general, first thing to put out there with creating your own mythological creatures and races, don't do anything that could even be vaguely Disney related. If it's even kind of sort of sounds like Disney, stop. Run away. Don't do that. Disney's a scary entity that will come for you. And like I said, you can sometimes get away with things and then just end up paying royalty fees. There's a lot of people that, for instance, do stuff with Dungeons and Dragons or the things like that. And basically how they do it, if they make a TV show or something like that, is they just say, hey, because we play Dungeons and Dragons in this TV show, you get 1% of whatever we make from this show and things like that. And so that's what royalty fees is about. So you can get arrested if they're mean, or if they're nice, you end up having to pay them money. So either way, not great. This is why we're talking about making your own stuff, so you can avoid that altogether.
Either that or they'll say get rid of it.
That's fair, or they'll just say get rid of it altogether.
The only thing in my stories that, like in one of my stories, is the Lord of the Ring names. Like, not the names of the characters, the names of the places. Like, what did I keep calling it, the Shire?
I was gonna say there is a place called the Shire, so. But yes, I would say in general, if it's not in public domain, don't use it. It doesn't matter if it's a place, it doesn't matter if it's people, it doesn't matter if it's a race, it doesn't matter if it's a character, especially because people get very aggressive about those kinds of things.
Yeah.
And so if you are going to use those things, make sure you either have permission from the owner or that you have made some sort of agreement with them to give them royalty fees or something like that. Those are about the only two ways you can get around it.
Either that or you take the word that's copyrighted and spell it backwards.
Spell it backwards. It's orc with a K. No, I don't do that. But the spelling it backwards is creative. But spelling it differently can sometimes still get people. Yes.
I was so mad about it. I'm like, wait a minute.
Once you spell it backwards, no one recognizes it. It's completely unrecognizable.
They're smart.
This is true. All right, so that's the first thing that I wanted to get out of the way before we talk about creating your mythological creatures and races, is in general, when it comes to creating stuff, if you're going to do fan fiction, just keep in mind that it either has to be completely and utterly, like, you're not making any money off of it, or if you plan to publish it and make money off of it, you got to talk to the actual people who own the stuff. Which, I mean, you can. There's the one lady who wrote the whole Descendants and stuff like that. She literally just approached them and said, hey, can I pitch this idea to you? And they said yes. So it's not that it can't happen, just keep in mind that you gotta go directly to the source. If she had tried to publish that without Disney, they would have absolutely slaughtered her. Just murder.
And look how Descendants went.
Exactly, it went well because of the fact that she actually, like, went and talked to them and they didn't murder her.
The first
Well,
one,
yeah,
and
but
that
is the one problem. That is the one problem, is that when you are working with a bigger entity, they may force you to do more books than you want and things like that. Even with regular books, unfortunately. I mean, for example, Wizard of Oz, it was actually really funny. He actually got so annoyed with Dorothy because of the fact that they put in his contract that all the books had to be about Dorothy. And he didn't want all the books to be about Dorothy. He actually didn't like Dorothy. And so he was sitting here like, oh, fine, she showed up for 2 seconds at the end. Happy editors. Like, he was very salty after a while.
He went on his villain arc.
He did. He went on his little villain arc where he's like, guess what? This whole book is about the Scarecrow. But psych, Dorothy shows up for 2 seconds. So technically, she's in it. So,
You can't do anything to me now.
Yeah, so beware in general. Working with publishers and big companies can be difficult, so don't make it harder on yourself by doing copyrighted things. And always double check, because as you mentioned before, some of the Dungeons and Dragons races, for instance, are perfectly well within your rights to use. However, there are other things that they created and therefore are not in the public domain and are there will have you pay royalty fees if you use them, or alternatively, just cancel you entirely. And so I would recommend at least Googling, is this in the public domain, before you use anything. A song, a title, a place, a people, whatever.
Yeah, I usually always do
All right.
that because I get so nervous.
Yeah, there's just so many things out there. Anyway, so moving forward with this kind of stuff, first we're going to talk about with creating races. How do your characters look? And secondarily, with that, how do your characters pass down genetic traits? For example, if you have a character that has blue skin and a character that looks perfectly normal and human, if they had children together, would they be lightly blue skinned or would they just fully be blue skinned because that's the dominant trait? Or is blue skin the recessive trait and they end up looking perfectly normal and human? Or is it just a mix and match and they just end up looking blue and white simultaneously, kind of that vitiligo kind of look? Like,
Yeah.
who knows? You honestly need to figure that out because that will help not only define your races but also help define culture. Because obviously, as has been shown in our own culture, unfortunately, a lot of people judge by the color of people's skin and various racial features. Um, and so whether or not that's the case in your book, it will still be important because unfortunately some people are racist. It's just the part of life that sucks. And so the likelihood that there will be no racism in the world that you've created is literally impossible. There will at least be a couple of people who are mean.
Unless it's a dystopian.
Unless it's a dystopian and they're like, if you're racist, we kill you. then it's a little bit psychotic in the other direction.
I actually saved someone from that today.
So in general, it's important that you think of these things. Think about what you're going to do with your classes and races, and do certain races look down on other races? And if so, why? For example, a lot of people say that elves look down on humans because of the fact that humans don't live as long and don't look as pretty in their opinion. And so as a result, they're like, ugh, there's ugly little short-lived things. But you don't have to have your elves be that way. You could have your elves be like very benevolent and instead be like, those poor, unfortunate humans. And like be maybe very benevolent instead and be like, see them as puppies and be like, we're gonna take care of you. Like, who knows? You can make your races however you want, but make sure that you know what they racially look like and how those genetics are passed down, because that will create interesting things for your characters and interesting ways of interacting and interesting cultural norms in your universe. Yes, question.
That isn't a question, but it is a comment.
That works too. Go for it.
So I have multiple races. Well, I rolled elves included. Kind of how I did it isn't the normal of just like with humans, but it's within each other. Like males are usually seen as more regal and stuff, while females live in the woods more often and are more with the elements.
Yeah, so you can also have different things with gender norms. We're actually going to talk about that in bullet points. So next one talking about this is actually genetic diseases and things like that, like hemophilia, for instance. Those are things that you can pass down genetically that you just have. And so are there things like that in your society? Is it like, for example, maybe your society has very extra sensitive noses, and that's like a very important thing culturally. And there's a genetic disease that makes it so they can't smell anything. And that's like really rough for them because it's the equivalent of being deaf, you know? Like, that's really hard. So think about how those genetic diseases work, how common they are, how much it would affect the person to have those genetic diseases. That can be a really fun way of creating uniquely disabled characters to have that disability representation without being classically human, just because a lot of times we do human disabilities for inhuman characters. And if you have an inhuman character, they're likely to have a different disability than would affect a human. Yes?
Another one, and I'm not sure if they count, but mixed races, like especially in fantasy settings, like one's an elf and another's an ogre.
Yeah, no, for sure. Certain races wouldn't be able to have children together, or if they did, they would be incredibly like disabled or have problems just because their genetics are a bad mix. I mean, heck, that even happens with humans, where two people get together and they're like, "We're so in love, we're gonna have wonderful children," and then it turns out that they have this one gene that makes it so they either can't have children or their children are all blind or something like that. It can happen. It's crazy, but it can happen. Certain genes just aren't meant to go together. Comment or question?
Um, one of my friends at school, all her siblings has at least one limb gone because of one of their parents
Yeah,
being
because
in
genetics just didn't blend well. Yeah, that can happen. And so think about for your characters, if, for example, in the example, an ogre and an elf got together, would they even be able to reproduce? And if they did, what kind of consequences would there be for that? How do their genetics just not blend well in a way that makes it so that they might have more problems? This, again, can be a very interesting way of developing your world culturally. All right, moving forward. So, you got to think about why your physical traits are important. So, for example, if they have a really acute sense of smell, maybe it's because all the plants look the same, and the only way to differentiate a good plant from a bad plant is smell, or something like that. You got to make sure that whatever you create for that race is crucial for the race's survival. Or if it's not crucial for the race's survival, you have some sort of magical means behind it. For example, with elves, typically the longevity and the almost borderline immortality for them has something to do with being, more honed into the magic genetically almost, And so, what does your race have that makes them live longer, or make them live shorter, or make them have horns, or maybe they just have horns because their parents have horns and there's no real reason for it anymore, but once upon a time they used them to hunt or something like that. There's a lot of different things that you can play around with that and make it extra fun and exciting. All right. Speaking of which, how do your characters age? This is going to be incredibly important to your character because you could have a character who lives for thousands of years and still looks 20. Or you could have a character who lives for 5 years, and so age of adulthood is 2. Those all need to be taken into account. And you also need to take into account what, as a result, is considered even adulthood. If you have a ton of different races with a ton of different lifespans, what even does adulthood mean anymore? Right? If you have one person who doesn't reach adulthood till they're 100 and another person who reaches adulthood at 2, like, huh? How does that work together societally? Yeah.
Sorry, I do have a question. Is
Yeah.
it possible to have all of them essentially age the same as long
Yeah.
as you have a reasonable explanation?
As long as you have a reasonable explanation, absolutely. The main thing is just that most races age differently. I mean, think about dogs versus cats versus humans versus birds. They all age differently, right? Entirely different. Lifespan and expectancy is all different, no matter what you look at. And so it's just unlikely, but not impossible. For example, cats and dogs are similar lifespan, even though technically I believe it's cats have a slightly longer lifespan than dogs, but it's not by a lot. And so you could even do it by a smidgen and be like, the life expectancy for humans is 80 and the life expectancy for elves is 100 or something like that. That way their age of adulthood would be similar, but they live a little longer or they live a little shorter or something like that. Or you can just have a fancy magical explanation for why they're all the same.
Magic.
As long as it makes more sense than just because magic. Because even though you can do just because magic, a lot of people tend to look at that and go, They prefer something a little more complex than just magic throws sparkles in the air. That works for about if you're writing for like anywhere from 10 to 11-year-olds, but once you get past 11 it's like, okay, I want to actually know why. I don't want you to just throw sparkles in my face and say poof.
Or if it's a comedy, and that's the purpose.
Yeah,
of
or
it.
unless it's a comedy and you constantly are making fun of the fact where it's like, why do we age at the same rate? That doesn't make sense. And it's like, I don't know, because the author said so. So keep in mind, how would their culture be affected by whatever their physical traits are? For example, if they're incredibly tall, their buildings are probably going to be taller, right? If they're incredibly short, their buildings are probably going to have very limited space. And beyond that, then what happens when, let's say, an elf comes to visit a dwarf? Do they just have to go like this everywhere? Like, can they even survive in a dwarven
Obviously, no.
city? Just walking around on all fours. Hi.
Or the cruel.
Like, so how do they make that work? How do multicultural cities work within all of these different fantasy races or science fiction races? Maybe you're doing alien races and like there's a race of turtle people. I don't know. Who knows? Whatever you want to come up with is you let your imagination run wild and be free. But keep in mind that those kinds of things are going to be important to look at. And maybe your races evolve over time too. For example, because we are better fed and better taken care of as a race, we are now taller. The average person was much shorter back then. And so you can go back into the average height for women and men all the way back as far as we know, and it's literally super short. Like the tallest man was, you know, 4'5", and now all of a sudden it's like tallest man is 6 foot. It's because we've been eating more, we've been taking better care of ourselves, those kinds of things, which all play a factor in height. And so you can even have things like that, where maybe let's say you could invent a fantasy race where it's like dwarves are actually freakishly tall now because of the fact that they were previously, only living on bread and cheese in the caves, and now that they've left the caves, they've become these behemoths, of just absolute unit. Just, whoa, big dwarf.
Oh, we're gonna see dwarves. What the crap?
And just hi, this massive person. Yeah, you never know.
6 years old.
And you can also have different and then we're gonna move on to this, where you can also have different gender roles and the way that different genders look and work. For example, a lot of times they talk about how in some books and fantasy cultures, dwarven women actually have beards. Even though in our world, if you had a beard, everyone would be like, whoa, why do you have a beard? But if you're so what's seen as a sign of femininity and what's seen as a sign of masculinity might be entirely different. Or you might not even have gender as a concept. Maybe they're an amorphous blob. They're completely and utterly genderless because they're a slime cube. Like, who knows? You can play around with those roles. You can play around with the idea of, instead of a patriarchy, having a matriarchy. Maybe all the women are in charge and super buff and awesome, and the men are just like, I'll sweep the kitchen for you. Like, who knows? You can flip all sorts of things on their head culturally and in fun sorts of interesting ways. Yeah.
Sorry, my brain.
That's okay. Brain went, ugh.
Was matriarchy.
Yeah.
I say the last one.
Yeah, matriarchy.
Especially if you have animal-based races.
Yeah, for sure. There's a lot of animal races that are actually matriarchies.
Yeah. One of them I have based off butterflies.
Mm-hmm.
And I can't remember where I learned it, but females, even though they're less prominent, they
Mm-hmm.
are essentially higher up, probably because there are less of them.
Yeah, and so there are actually a lot of things. If you want to do animal-based races, you can absolutely play with those kinds of ideas of maybe it's a matriarchy, or maybe even, I mean, snails have both genders. Snails are neither male nor female. They are technically androgynous. They have both.
They are, yes.
They are, yes. They're not even non-binary. They're just both. And so you can have a race of snail people, and they don't really understand gender. And so you have a female elf and a male elf show up, and they're like, can we get separate rooms? And they're like, why? And they're like, because I'm a girl and a guy. And they're like,
And done both.
Exactly, like, they're just sitting there confused. Like, that can be a very interesting thing to play with as a fantasy or science fiction race that you could create. And it could create some comedic moments like that, where the poor snail person is just like, dude, why do you need separate rooms? That's weird. So it can be fun things to play with and fun things to interact with and to explore. All right, next thing is, what do they need to eat and what do they need to drink? Especially if you're going with science fiction races, if this specific race has developed on an aquatic planet, let's say, they probably primarily eat fish and things like that, and might have never even eaten things like rabbit or chicken in their entire lives. And so if they visited another planet, they'd be like, the heck is this? And so, and they might actually need water to breathe and things like that. So they might need kind of a reverse scuba suit in order to even walk on land and things like that. Or even you can go the vampire route. Do they need blood to survive, or is that just, a hurtful rumor? You can kind of look at those kinds of things and explore with also, racial stereotypes, if you want. I know that I created a Dungeons and Dragons scenario where Fae actually aren't really mean and they don't really do the changeling thing. They do adopt humans because a lot of them can't have children, but they don't exchange them for changelings. That's a very hurtful stereotype. And so you can play with that too.
When I was in your D&D Phoenix opposite, my character was in Fae, but I adopted everyone.
See that? There you go. You could also have the random human be like, yes,
I adopted
all my children.
You're not all my children, but I'm 45.
And then also, what do they need to drink? Theoretically, if we were in a science fiction universe where we'd already made contact with aliens, there probably are aliens out there that don't drink water. Maybe they drink, I don't know, maybe they drink something entirely different, like sulfur water or sand. I don't know, mud. Maybe they need those minerals. They're like, if it's pure water, it'll kill me, but if it's mud, it'll do all the good things. I don't know, or lava. Maybe there's a race out there that drinks lava. I don't know. You can come up with all sorts of things.
Honestly, that would be really cool.
Just sitting there at a sci-fi bar, and one person gets handed a mug of lava, the other person gets handed wine. But yeah, you can totally play around with what they feed off of, what they drink, and also use that to even maybe create cultural interesting things. Maybe the people who drink lava are actually really offended that people are so afraid of volcanoes and think that's like really rude. Or something like that.
It's a delicacy.
It's a delicacy. How dare you? Like, just run away from it and waste all that perfectly good magma. Like, who knows? You can create cultural dissonance through these kinds of things, especially because food and drink can be very culturally diversifying things. I mean, heck, even just think about in Asia, durian, the literal corpse fruit, is considered a delicacy. And yet around here, most people are like, that thing smells like a literal corpse. I'm not eating that. And so it's very polarizing, right? And so looking at those kinds of things, it's important to think about culturally what they might eat and drink and what they need to survive and how much of it they need to survive. For example, in The Lord of the Rings, they have that whole special bread that can just fill you up with one bite and things like that.
That would be amazing.
Right? And so it's very interesting things like this that can be played around with, as races and things like that. All right. Last two things. First, how smart are they? That's another thing you need to take into account because obviously, just like the races we have on this races/species we have on this planet, cats, dogs, birds, humans. Let's just go back to that analogy. Some are smarter than others, to say the least. Sometimes you look in that beautiful, wonderful golden retriever's eyes and there's nothing going on. They're just like happy to be there. And then there's no thoughts, just vibes. And then there are other creatures where you look at their eyes and you can tell they're like, if you don't feed me right now, I will stare into your soul. And so there are all sorts of different things with how intelligent creatures are. And so, of course, there's going to be the same if you run into alien or fantasy species. Maybe there are certain species that are just naturally super intelligent, or maybe there's other species that are like, how did you survive this long? You might have one species where you're like, looking at them and going, dude, I literally don't know how they survived. Is they like ran into a wall and cried? I don't know. Maybe they're really just super dumb. And you can play around with that too, having extra smart races or really, really dumb races, and play around with too how they did survive then. Did they survive on instinct? Did they survive because they're really, really good at adapting, even if they're really, really dumb? Or if they're super, super intelligent? How does that affect them in their society?
Oh
Yeah, or maybe they've actually proven that feral cats have more brain matter than domesticated cats. But anyway, so if you want a smart cat, go to the shelter. No, I'm kidding. But also not kidding because shelters need more cats adopted. But anyway, yeah, they will be smarter more than likely.
Okay, I'll adopt 50 cats.
50 cats.
I would adopt a horse instead.
There's that too. So honestly, you don't know with that how that's going to play into it until you think about it. Just play around with that idea. And also play around with the idea of memory, too. As we mentioned with the aging thing, if you do have a race that lives thousands of years, do they easily forget the last 1,000 years? Or does it all start to blur together? I know someone made a joke the other day saying, well, if vampires live forever, then why don't they just use all this old slang all the time? And so it's like, even though they look like they're 20, for some reason they're talking like a 70s rapper or something like that. And it's like, why? Because they're heckin' old and they're thousands of years old. Or I know that there's another person who wrote vampires in such a way where it's like they just fell in love with the Southern Belle accent. And so they continue to do it, even though it's 2025. And so you can play around with that with your older races. Or if they have super short lived races, maybe they're extra, extra good at like living in the present and living in the moment because they realize their lifespans are insanely short. Um, and so you can kind of play around with how much do they remember? How does that affect their culture too, as well? That's another part of the reason people think that elves look down on humans if they were to exist, is because they're like, oh, they just keep making the same mistakes. How stupid! And it's like it's not stupidity. It's that we have a shorter lifespan than you, so it's harder to learn from our mistakes if the people who learned from those mistakes keep dying off. Hard to keep that in check if we're not able to relate to that. All right, and then last thing, whether it's science fiction or magic, how does that play into that? Like I said with elves, are they long lived because of magic, or are they long lived because of some other thing, like maybe a religion or something like that they worship? Um, or if you have a science fiction universe, maybe people are living longer because they've started to replace their body parts with cyborg parts. Or maybe they've started to live longer because they have more access to crazy new medicines and things like that. Or mutations and crazy things like that. So humans aren't even really looking human anymore. You can play around with science fiction and magic in that way to enhance your world or to just make it easier to do certain things. If you're just like, you know what, I really want this race or this person to live longer, you can come up with a reason, whether it's science fiction or magical. All right, any questions about creating science fiction and fantasy races before we move on to creating science fiction and fantasy creatures? We good? Okay, let's move on to creatures. So, with creatures, even though we did mention this with humans and needing to like have a reason for their racial traits, you definitely need to have a reason if it's a creature. Because of the fact that, like dogs and cats, typically they've evolved for a reason. Cats have claws, dogs have very, very sharp teeth, all these different things. And so you need to make it sure when you're creating your creature, why do they have these things? For example, dragons, they can fly. Why do they need to fly? A lot of people don't necessarily think about that. So you can also just do whatever you like. But if you'd like to, you can also play around with it and say, hey, dragons need to fly maybe because they need to escape. So what's bigger than a dragon that a dragon needs to escape from? And then you can invent that creature and play around with that. Or you can also have it be that they're just an insanely big predator. I mean, hawks have amazing flight abilities and claws, and the only reason they need that is because they're a carnivore. So snatches up a mouse, yum yum. And so you could go the carnivorous route, you could go the needs to protect themselves route, and then create a bigger, badder creature. You can also play around with various just racial traits that don't make sense, too. For example, the platypus. Um, there are some creatures that you just look at and you're like, none of you make sense. And that's okay. So if you want to play around with that with your creatures, you can literally just go to a basic like mythology textbook and then be like, I take this, I take that, and I go squish and make a really fun mythological creature. Yes, exactly. Behold my monstrosity. And you could play around with that. The beauty of the creatures, though, is that there's so many mythological creatures that you can play with, and that you can put your own spin on, and that you can fiddle with, and that you can make your own rules for. For example, what if your vampires are completely immune to sunlight? No problems. Like, how would that affect things? How would vampires eventually take over? Or is there another reason why they haven't taken over the world yet and they're, in hiding? What is that about? You can play around with your creatures having different strengths and weaknesses, Or you could even just put your own spin on an old thing. I know there's a lot of people actually who theorize that because unicorns have horns, they are a predator and they actually, are like carnivorous and stuff. And so you can play around with even just the opposite. Say, what if this wonderful, peaceful, mythical creature became an absolute psycho killer? How would that work? It can be fun to play with those ideas. And even if you don't use some of those ideas, you can always create mythical creatures and then write them down. I will say though, if your creature has any sort of like crazy, insane abilities, also make sure they have some weaknesses. For example, going back to the falcon, falcons are insanely good predators, just so long as they can fly. The second that you hurt their wings, they're useless. And so it's important to make sure that your creatures have weaknesses as well. What about them is a weakness that your characters could exploit to either take them down if they are attacking them, or alternatively to capture them? What are those weaknesses and why are they important? And are they magically or science fiction based? You could have a magical weakness where it's like they have no weaknesses except for they made a deal with a fairy, 5,000 years back, and so the fairies have their weakness or something like that. You can play around with those kinds of ideas as well. Um, the next thing that you need to think about, though, is also, once again, how do they blend well with other species? For example, you can't have a cat dog. Cats and dogs don't go together. They cannot have children. And so, similarly with your fantasy creatures, are there creatures that you can have more dangerous, more crazy children? Or are there creatures that that's never going to happen, and as a result, makes it so that less dangerous creatures are a problem, not a problem? You can not stress about, a dragon and a sphinx getting together because they can't. That would be terrifying. But you could also play with that too and be like, what if sphinxes and dragons could have children together? What terrifying monstrosities would they create? um, so, and then once again, how do they age? Because just like with animals, they all age differently. Tortoises live nearly forever in comparison to like a fly. And so, how do your creatures live? You could even play around with different versions of those in the regard that, like, what if a dragon was super short lived, like Fly? They only live 4 days, and that's why they just pillage and raid everything because they're like, I only live 4 days, eat everything. Or is it that they have a terrible temper and they're not very easily, calmed down, and that's why they raid villages? Like, play with how your creatures are going to work with that as well, especially with the aging aspect, because if they do live forever, why have people not killed them yet? Why have they not developed a whole, task force for dragon hunters? If they're such a big problem, why? You know? Yeah.
An idea could be maybe because they kill off each other.
Yeah, that's fair too. Maybe the dragons are so violent that they kill off each other, so there's no need to try and kill them off because eventually they'll all kill each other off. Who knows? Exactly, I like that. So you can play around with the creatures' things, and especially because there are some self-destructive creatures that have some very bad habits that you're just like, why would you do that?
Explode.
And then even you can come up with how do humans affect them. For example, recently someone was actually posting on Instagram that they were like, please, if you want your pumpkins to last longer, dip them in vinegar, not bleach. Why? Because squirrels, deer, and all sorts of other animals will come onto your porch to eat that pumpkin, and if you dip it in bleach, you're going to kill a bunch of animals. And so you got to think about the human impact too. If there are smaller magical creatures, or even if there are larger magical creatures, what kinds of human things are affecting their habitats? What kinds of human things may make them even go extinct, or different things like that? Maybe you could play with a magical universe in which lots of magical races have gone extinct just due to human neglect and things like that. So you got to think about how humans affect them as well, both in a negative and maybe even in a positive way. Is there a sanctuary for these creatures or something like that? All right. Any questions? Hello.
No.
Fair enough. How about you? How about you four? We good? Okay, cool.
We'll come closer to look at the stickers.
Yeah, because
All right. I'm going to turn this off after I give this one last announcement. So, Scary Story Contest entries are due October 11th. You do have to pay for the Scary Story one just because of the fact that technically I'm not the one who runs it. It's the Friends of the Library, and they do a lot of fun stuff for the library, but they can only do those fun things for the library if they have monies. So that's why a donation of $3 is required in order to enter your story. So you do not have to enter that contest, but if you would like to, the rules are basically don't be insanely gory / graphic, 1,500 words or less, and obviously pay your $3 fee, please. And also keep in mind for our Scary Story contest, it's scary / spooky themed, so you can be humorous if you want to. Yes?
What if it's more than
You can't enter it.
I think it was 1,500.
Yeah, it's 1,500 words.
Okay.
So
Yeah. So if it's less than 1,500, that's fine. But if it's more than 1,500, unfortunately, you will be disqualified. And yes, we can tell. So if it is, yeah, if it's less than 1,500, we're all good. If it's more than 1,500, I'm sorry, you will be disqualified. If it's like 10 or 20 words over, that's fine. But if it's like 100 words over, I'm sorry, we're axing you.
1.5 words over.
1.5 words over, that's fine.
Right?
What counts as a half word?
A cut off word, like they're screaming, ah!
Oh.
I don't know. Anyway, but yeah, so the only reason why we have the 1,500 word limit is purely just because we get so many entries that there's no way we can keep up with them all if it's more than 1,500. Sorry. But on the bright side, we have other contests that have a much longer word limit, so that's nice. For example, we have the first chapter contest coming up. That'll be due in December sometime. And you just need to write a first chapter that is 3,000 words or less. Any genre, anything that you want, just to write us a really good first chapter that makes us want to keep reading. And then in January, we'll have another contest coming up. That one's going to be romance themed. So.
That's the first one I entered, even though I was not writing romance.
Well, it's funny because it's actually a very popular one. A lot of people were like, "Why'd you get rid of that one?" So we're like, "Okay, we'll bring it back." But yeah, every winter, every January through February, aka winter, we will have a romance one, and then every spring we will have a fantasy one. Every summer we will have a one that is themed to whatever the reading thing is that year, and then every fall we will have a first chapter one. So there will be some recurrent themes now. As far as the fantasy one, I believe the fantasy one for that one is going to be create your own myth about springtime. So you can create your own fantasy like world and do a myth, or you can say like in today's world, this is my myth about spring or something like that. It just has to involve some aspect of spring. You could even be like the myth of how flowers blooming or came to be or something like that. I don't know. As long as it's spring related and it's your own myth. And then summer, the theme for this summer will be unearthing a story. And so as a result, with that one, we went with your story has to involve unearthing bones of some sort. They can be fantasy bones or science fiction bones or alien bones or whatever you want, as long as there's bones involved.
Digging up graves.
I'm hoping
Like digging out the bones, or just like seeing like the bones that like.
So as long as bones being unearthed is a crucial part of the plot. They don't necessarily have to be the ones discovering the bones, just as long as the bones being unearthed is what drives the plot forward. So, and obviously if you want to do something very unique, like I said, like alien bones or dragon bones or something like that, you absolutely can. Potato bones? I don't think potatoes have bones.
according to your knowledge.
According to my knowledge? Oh no. Now I'm alarmed. It looks at potato differently. All right.
Your potatoes still have bones?
Do yours? But anyway, all right, I'm going to turn off the video now. If you want to ask any other writing related questions, you are welcome. If you'd like to suggest any other writing lessons that you wish to have, you may also do so.